"I will buy the obese noblewoman for $1, said the mountain man at auction. That's what the crowd heard, and they roared with laughter. But when the mountain man stepped through the dust and slapped down his silver dollar, the laughter stopped. Because this wasn't just a rescue, it was a declaration. The woman they mocked? She holds a paper that can bring this whole town to its knees, a deed worth more than gold, more than railroads, more than every crooked man's fortune. And the man who bought her? He's done watching the powerful steal from the weak. But there's a storm coming, a gang with fire and guns, a spring that holds life itself, and a promise, long buried, is about to rise. As the church bell tolls and the hammers fall, this town will have to choose: stand with the woman bought for $1, or watch their land burn. When the dust settles, who will own the water? And who will be left with nothing but their pride? Before we begin, send a quick wave in the comments. Tell me your city, your country, your vibe. It's amazing how stories like this echo across the world. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's muddy auction yard. Lady Clementine Harrow stood on the rickety wooden platform, her shoulders straight, despite the shame burning in her chest. Her black mourning dress, once elegant, now bore the dust of her long journey west. Around her the crowd pressed close, their faces twisted with cruel amusement at her expense. "Look at the size of her," someone called out. "Ain't no horse strong enough to carry that load." Laughter rippled through the gathering. Clementine's cheeks flushed, but she kept her chin high, the way her mother had taught her all those years ago in London's grand ballrooms. The jeers felt sharper than any social slight she'd endured there. The auctioneer, a weasel-faced man in a stained waistcoat, worked the crowd with practiced skill. "What am I bid for this fine English lady? She can read, write, and keep accounts, though she might eat you out of house and home." More laughter followed his tasteless joke. $2, someone shouted. $1.50, another voice called, mockingly lower. $1? The auctioneer's voice dripped with false sympathy. "Surely this educated lady is worth more than that." The crowd fell silent as a tall figure moved through their midst. People stepped back, creating a path for the stranger. Clementine's eyes widened as she took in his appearance. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders shaped by years of mountain living. A long scar ran down the left side of his weathered face, disappearing into his graying beard. His buckskin jacket and worn boots spoke of countless miles traveled in the wilderness. "I will buy the obese noblewoman for $1, he said, his voice quiet, but carrying across the suddenly hushed yard. The auctioneer blinked, thrown off his rhythm by the stranger's direct approach. "Well now, Mr. The tall man stepped forward, placing a single silver dollar on the platform. The coin landed with a soft clink that seemed to echo in the silence. Without waiting for the auctioneer's response, he moved to untie Clementine's bound hands. His fingers were gentle despite their roughness, and Clementine felt a tremor run through her as the ropes fell away. She rubbed her wrists, studying his face, but his expression remained unreadable. "This way, ma'am," he said simply, offering his arm. Clementine took it, grateful for the support as she descended the platform's steep steps. Her legs shook, though whether from fear or relief, she couldn't say. The crowd parted before them, their earlier mockery replaced by uncertain whispers. They walked in silence through the town's muddy street. A wagon waited at the edge of the square, loaded with supplies and hitched to 2 sturdy mules. Clementine noticed the careful way everything was packed and tied down. This was a man who understood the challenges of frontier travel. When they reached the wagon, she finally found her voice. "Sir," she said, turning to face him, "why did you do this?" The mountain man's scarred face remained impassive, but something flickered in his deep-set eyes. He studied her for a long moment, as if weighing his words carefully. The evening breeze stirred his graying hair, carrying with it the scent of sage and distant rain. Clementine waited, aware of the town's curious eyes still watching from a distance. Her heart pounded with uncertainty. This strange, imposing man had saved her from public humiliation. But to what end? She had heard terrible stories of women sold on the frontier, tales that kept proper English ladies awake at night. Yet something in his steady gaze made her hold her ground. Despite his intimidating appearance, she sensed no malice in him. His actions on the auction platform had been marked by a quiet dignity that stood in sharp contrast to the crowd's cruelty. "Because," he finally said, in that same quiet voice that had silenced the auction yard, "no human being should be sold like cattle." He paused, then added, "Name's Ezekiel Boone." His words hung in the air between them, simple but weighted with meaning. Clementine felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back. This was not the time for weakness, not when she still had no idea what fate awaited her. "Lady Clementine Harrow," she replied, clinging to the proper introductions that were all she had left of her former life. Though I suppose the lady hardly matters anymore. The sun dipped lower on the horizon, painting the dusty street in shades of gold and purple. From somewhere in the distance came the lonely cry of a meadowlark, calling out to the approaching night. The wagon lurched over the rocky trail, each bump sending jolts through Clementine's already aching body. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows through the ponderosa pines as they climbed higher into the mountains. She gripped the wooden seat, trying to maintain her composure despite her exhaustion. Ezekiel handled the reins with practiced ease, guiding his mules around the worst of the ruts. The steady clip-clop of their hooves and the creak of leather harnesses filled the silence between them. Clementine stole glances at her rescuer's profile, still unsure what to make of this quiet mountain man. The memory of the auction yard burned fresh in her mind. The cruel laughter, the mockery, the feeling of being reduced to less than human. It all threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained dignity. She straightened her spine, refusing to let her shoulders slump. "Might rain tonight," Ezekiel said, breaking the long silence. He nodded toward dark clouds gathering over the distant peaks. "Cabin's not far now." "I appreciate your kindness, Mr. Boone," Clementine said, her cultured accent stark against the wilderness surrounding them, "though I confess I'm still at a loss as to why you chose to intervene." Ezekiel was quiet for several moments, considering his words. "Saw wrong being done," he said finally. "Simple as that. Man can't stand by when folks treat others like they ain't human." His straightforward answer touched something deep in Clementine's heart. There was no pity in his voice, no condescension, just a plain statement of moral certainty. The trail curved around a steep hillside, revealing a small clearing ahead. Ezekiel's cabin sat nestled against the mountainside, smoke curling from its stone chimney. It was modest but well-maintained, with a small vegetable garden to one side and a sturdy barn nearby. "Home," Ezekiel said simply, bringing the wagon to a stop. Clementine took in the rough-hewn logs and simple porch. It was a far cry from her London townhouse or even the frontier mansion her late husband had promised to build. Yet something about its honest simplicity appealed to her. "You're welcome to stay tonight," Ezekiel said, helping her down from the wagon. "Got spare room, no proper bed, but it's dry and warm." The first drops of rain began to fall as they reached the porch. Inside, a fire crackled in the hearth, casting warm light across the single room. Simple furnishings, a table, chairs, a cook stove, and shelves lined with books, spoke of a life stripped to essentials. "Please sit," Ezekiel gestured to a chair by the fire. He moved about the cabin with efficient grace, putting on coffee and pulling out bread and dried meat for their supper. The warmth of the fire slowly seeped into Clementine's tired bones. She watched as Ezekiel prepared their simple meal, his movements suggesting long practice at caring for himself. "You have books," she observed, noting several familiar titles on his shelves. "Like to read," he replied, setting 2 tin plates on the table. "Helps pass the winter months." Over their humble supper, Clementine found herself sharing the story she'd held close these past months. "My husband Charles had a vision for this territory," she said, her voice soft with memory. He believed the railroad could bring prosperity to all, settlers and native peoples alike. But his partners? She paused, the betrayal still raw. They sabotaged the venture, altered documents, redirected funds. By the time Charles discovered their treachery, it was too late. Ezekiel listened intently, his scarred face thoughtful in the firelight. They control most of the water rights now, Clementine continued, but I still have the original papers. Documents proving Charles intended those rights to be shared, not hoarded. She gave a bitter laugh. Not that it matters now. What authority would listen to a destitute widow? Water's worth more than gold out here, Ezekiel said quietly, his deep voice carrying the weight of frontier wisdom. His words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications neither yet voiced. The fire popped and sparked, sending shadows dancing across the cabin's walls. Outside, rain drummed steadily on the roof, but inside something new had kindled, a spark of purpose, of possibility, between two unlikely allies brought together by fate and simple human decency. Dawn painted the mountain peaks in soft golden light as Ezekiel's axe split another log. The steady rhythm of his work echoed through the crisp morning air. Inside the cabin, Clementine had insisted on making breakfast, determined to repay his kindness with what skills she possessed. The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke through the morning quiet. Ezekiel paused, resting his axe against the chopping block as a dust-covered rider appeared on the trail. The young man's horse was lathered with sweat, suggesting urgent business. "Mr. Boone?" the courier called out, pulling his mount to a stop. "Got a telegram from Silver Bluff. Agency clerk said it's important." Ezekiel wiped his hands on his shirt and took the folded paper. The courier waited, catching his breath while his horse pawed at the ground. The cabin door creaked open as Clementine emerged, drawn by the commotion. She watched as Ezekiel's face darkened while reading the message. "Much obliged," Ezekiel said to the courier, pressing a coin into the young man's hand. The rider touched his hat brim and turned his horse back down the trail. "What news?" Clementine asked, her hands clutching her shawl against the morning chill. Ezekiel's jaw tightened. "Railroad partners are moving fast, filing deeds at the land office, false ones, claiming rights to the Apache reservation's spring." He handed her the telegram. "Assessor's court date set for 3 days from now." Clementine's hands trembled as she read. The familiar anger rose in her chest. The same fury she'd felt watching her husband's dreams crumble under the weight of betrayal. "Those greedy vultures," she spat. "They won't stop until they've stolen every drop of water in the territory." She straightened her spine. Years of proper bearing asserting themselves. "I have the original deeds. Charles's true documents. They prove the spring was meant to be shared." Her voice faltered. "But who would listen to me now? A bankrupt fat lady bought at auction." Ezekiel studied her for a long moment, his scarred face thoughtful. "Reckon I know someone who might listen?" He moved to put away his axe and wood-splitting tools. "Man named Nantan, elder of the White Mountain Apache. Fought alongside him years back before I left the army." "You served with the Apache?" Clementine asked, surprised. Ezekiel nodded, his expression guarded. "Scout company. Nantan taught me more about honor than any army officer ever did." He paused, considering. "He needs to know what's coming, and your deeds might be exactly what's needed to stop it." A spark of hope kindled in Clementine's chest. "You think he would help?" "Man's got wisdom," Ezekiel replied. "Knows how to fight battles without bloodshed." He gestured toward the barn. "If we leave now, we can reach their settlement by nightfall." Clementine's heart raced at the prospect. This was a chance, perhaps her only chance, to honor Charles's memory and see justice done. "I'll need a moment to gather the papers." While Clementine went inside to collect her documents, Ezekiel moved with practiced efficiency. He pulled his wagon under the barn's overhang and began harnessing the mule team. The animal's ears flicked back and forth as he checked their tackle, making sure everything was secure for the journey ahead. Clementine emerged from the cabin carrying a leather portfolio, her most precious possession. Inside lay the proof of her husband's intentions, documents that could save the Apache's water rights. If only they could make someone listen. Ezekiel helped her climb aboard the wagon, noting how she moved with fresh purpose, her earlier shame replaced by determination. The humiliated widow from yesterday's auction yard was transforming into something else, a woman with a mission. "Ready?" he asked, settling onto the seat beside her. Clementine clutched the portfolio to her chest and nodded. "Yes, Mr. Boone. Quite ready." The mules leaned into their harnesses as Ezekiel flicked the reins. The wagon rolled forward, leaving the safety of his homestead for the uncertain path ahead. Behind them, the morning sun climbed higher, casting their shadows long across the trail that would lead them to the Apache settlement, and perhaps to justice. The sound of wooden wheels crunching over rocky ground filled the air as they began their journey. Clementine held her head high, feeling for the first time since Charles's death that she might yet make things right. Beside her, Ezekiel guided the mules with steady hands, his presence solid and reassuring as the mountain itself. The wagon creaked and swayed as it followed the winding trail through scrubby juniper and pine. The summer sun beat down mercilessly, but Ezekiel kept the mules at a steady pace, knowing they had many miles ahead. Clementine dabbed at her forehead with a handkerchief, determined not to complain despite the discomfort of the rough journey. "Water's always been the heart of things out here," Ezekiel said, breaking their companionable silence. "More precious than gold or silver. Man can't live without it, can't grow without it, can't build without it." Clementine shifted on the hard wooden seat, trying to find a position that wouldn't leave her completely bruised. My Charles understood that. It's why he wanted to create a fair water-sharing system, not just another scheme to get rich. Ezekiel nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon. Apache knew the water's worth long before settlers came. They mapped every spring, every stream in these mountains. Then the treaties came. His voice grew tight, each one promising to protect their water rights, each one broken. "Like the one your army unit was meant to enforce?" Clementine asked gently. "That's what broke me in the end." Ezekiel's hands tightened on the reins, watching good men like Nantan try to believe in promises that turned to dust, made me question everything I thought I knew about right and wrong. The wagon hit a particularly deep rut, jolting them both. Clementine couldn't suppress a small yelp, then laughed at herself. "Oh dear, I suspect I'll be black and blue by sunset, but better sore than sold at auction, wouldn't you say?" A ghost of a smile crossed Ezekiel's scarred face. He was beginning to appreciate her spirit. The sun was sinking toward the western peaks when they finally approached the Apache settlement. Smoke from cooking fires rose in thin columns against the darkening sky. Children playing at the outskirts spotted them first, running to alert the adults. Within moments, several men appeared, watching their approach with guarded expressions. Ezekiel drew the wagon to a halt at a respectful distance. He raised his hand in greeting, speaking a few words in Apache that made the tension ease slightly. An older man emerged from one of the larger dwellings, Nantan, his silver hair and dignified bearing marking him as a leader. "Ezekiel Boone," Nantan said, his voice deep and measured. "Many seasons since you walked these paths?" "Too many, my friend." Ezekiel climbed down from the wagon, then helped Clementine descend. She moved carefully, stiff from the long ride but determined to show proper respect. Nantan's dark eyes studied her carefully. "You bring a stranger to our fires." "Lady Clementine Harrow," she introduced herself, meeting his gaze directly. "I come seeking your wisdom and perhaps to offer help if you're willing to hear me." "Help?" Skepticism tinged Nantan's voice. What help could an English lady offer the Apache? Clementine squared her shoulders. I bring proof that the railroad men are lying about the water rights. My late husband's documents show the spring was meant to be shared, managed together, not stolen by those who see only profit. A murmur ran through the gathering crowd. Nantan's expression remained neutral, but his eyes sharpened with interest. Come, he said after a moment. Share our fire. We will hear your words. As darkness settled over the mountains, they sat in a circle around the dancing flames. Clementine spread out her documents, explaining each one carefully. She didn't hide her own losses or humiliations, speaking plainly about the auction and her determination to see justice done. I don't seek to control the water, she emphasized, meeting the eyes of each person in the circle. I propose we manage it together. Apache, settlers, all who depend on it for life. Not for profit, but for the good of all. Nantan listened intently, asking pointed questions about legal details and practical arrangements. His initial skepticism gradually gave way to thoughtful consideration. You speak truth, he said finally. But truth does not always prevail in white man's courts. No, Clementine agreed, but perhaps together we can make them listen. Your knowledge of the land, my husband's documents, Mr. Boone's. She glanced at Ezekiel. Persuasive presence? Together we might succeed where separately we would fail. Nantan studied the fire for a long moment. The flames cast flickering shadows across his weathered face as he weighed her words. Finally, he looked up. Tomorrow we will make plans for this court battle, he said. Tonight, you are our guests. Share our meal? Rest from your journey? As women brought forward bowls of fragrant stew, Clementine felt the first real hope she'd known in months. She caught Ezekiel watching her with something like admiration in his eyes. Together, they had forged the beginning of an alliance, fragile perhaps, but built on a foundation of shared respect and common purpose. Around them, the fire crackled and sparked toward the star-filled sky, while the assembled group began discussing strategies for the coming confrontation at the land court. Dawn broke over the Apache settlement with threads of pink and gold stretching across the sky. Clementine stood with Ezekiel near the dying embers of last night's council fire, watching Taklishim approach. The young Apache man moved with the quiet grace of a mountain lion, his dark eyes alert and intelligent. The trail to Silver Bluff will be busy today, Taklishim said in perfect English. Railroad men's spies watch the telegraph office, but I know another way. He sketched a rough map in the dirt with a stick. I can send a trusted rider to Fort Carson. The federal marshal there. He is honest. He has stood against the railroad before. Clementine nodded, adjusting her shawl against the morning chill. How long would it take your rider to reach him? 2 days there, 2 days back. The marshal could be in Silver Bluff before the week's end. Taklishim glanced at his father's dwelling. Nantan agrees this is wise. We need the law on our side, but the law must be uncorrupted. Much obliged, Ezekiel said quietly. Your father chose well in trusting you with this task. A ghost of a smile crossed Taklishim's face. The old ways and the new, we must learn to walk both paths. He straightened, brushing dirt from his hands. You should leave soon. Storm clouds are building in the west. The warning proved prophetic. Ezekiel and Clementine had been on the trail for perhaps 4 hours when the summer storm struck with shocking ferocity. The temperature plunged as dark clouds boiled overhead, thunder cracked like rifle shots, and rain fell in stinging sheets. Within minutes, the trail transformed into treacherous mud. The wagon wheels began to sink and slide, forcing Ezekiel to guide the mules with extreme care. Clementine gripped the seat with white-knuckled hands as they slipped and lurched along the path. There's an overhang ahead, Ezekiel shouted over the thunder. We'll wait it out there. The limestone outcropping provided blessed shelter from the worst of the deluge. Ezekiel helped Clementine down from the wagon, then quickly unhitched the mules and led them under cover. The animals shook themselves, spattering everyone with more water. "Oh!" Clementine couldn't help laughing, despite her sodden state. "As if we weren't wet enough already." She wrung water from her skirts, then settled onto a relatively dry boulder. Though I suppose this is proper frontier life, taking whatever shelter nature provides. Ezekiel nodded, pulling their food satchel from the wagon. "Been caught in worse? At least we have dry bread and company." He offered her a share of their simple provisions. They ate in companionable silence for a while, watching the rain fall in gray curtains. Thunder rolled more distantly now, and the worst seemed to be passing. "I had a shelter like this once," Ezekiel said suddenly, his voice soft. "During my scouting days. Holed up with an Apache family, mother. 2 little ones. They were trying to reach their relatives, staying clear of the fighting." He stared into the rain. "Found out later that my reports helped the army track down their band. Never forgot their faces. Never forgot that I'd broken their trust, even without meaning to." Clementine listened intently, hearing the old pain in his words. "Is that when you left the army?" "Soon after. Couldn't stomach being part of it anymore. The broken treaties, the lies." His scarred face was shadowed. "Bought this land up here, far from everything. Figured solitude was what I deserved." "I understand isolation," Clementine said quietly. "After Charles died, London society had no use for a widow who wouldn't fit their mold. Too fat, too outspoken, too... everything." She smoothed her damp skirts. "When the railroad partners stole everything, they thought they were delivering the final blow to my dignity. But perhaps they did me a favor, driving me west. At least here, I might do some good." Ezekiel turned to look at her. Really look at her. Perhaps for the first time. He saw past the surface that society scorned to the steel beneath. The sharp mind, the resilient spirit, the compassionate heart. "Reckon they underestimated you," he said simply. Clementine felt warmth bloom in her chest, despite her damp clothes. "As they underestimated you, I suspect. A man who chooses justice over duty, who helps strangers without seeking reward, that's not someone who deserves solitude as punishment." Their eyes met in the gray stormlight, and something shifted between them. A lowering of walls, a recognition of kindred spirits. Both knew what it meant to be judged, and found wanting by society's narrow measures. Both knew the cost of holding to one's principles. The rain began to slacken, and thin bars of sunlight pierced the clouds. Soon they would need to continue their journey to Silver Bluff, to prepare for the coming legal battle. But for now they sat in comfortable silence. 2 exiles who had perhaps found something unexpected: understanding, respect, and the first fragile tendrils of trust. Dusk painted Silver Bluff in shades of purple when Ezekiel's wagon finally rolled into town. The muddy streets were mostly empty, with only a few lanterns flickering in windows. He guided the mules down a narrow side street, away from the main thoroughfare where curious eyes might spot them. Miss Opal Fairweather's modest home sat at the edge of town, its whitewashed walls glowing softly in the failing light. A small garden of herbs and flowers lined the front path, their rain-fresh scent filling the air. Before Ezekiel could even help Clementine down from the wagon, the front door opened, spilling warm lamplight onto the porch. "Land's sakes, you 2 look like drowned cats," Opal said, her gray eyes sharp but kind in her weathered face. She wore a simple black dress, her silver hair neatly pinned back. "Get yourselves inside before someone sees you." The interior of Opal's home was as neat as its owner, simple furnishings arranged with care, dried herbs hanging from the rafters, and a cheery fire crackling in the hearth. The smell of fresh bread and coffee filled the air. "Ezekiel Boone," Opal said, hands on her hips. "When you pulled me through that fever last winter, I never imagined you'd call in your favor quite like this." She turned to Clementine with a respectful nod. "Lady Harrow, welcome to my home. It's not what you're used to, I expect, but it's clean and safe." "Please call me Clementine," she replied, touched by the formal address. "And after today's adventures, your home looks like paradise itself." Opal's expression softened. "Well then, Clementine, let's get you into some dry clothes. I've something that might serve for tomorrow's court appearance, too." She shot Ezekiel a pointed look. "You know where the spare room is, Mr. Boone. Get yourself settled while we women folk talk." In Opal's bedroom, the older woman pulled a dress from her wardrobe. Deep blue cotton, simply cut but well made. "My niece left this here last visit," she explained. "She's a big girl too, bless her heart. With a few quick alterations, you'll look every inch the lady you are." Clementine ran her fingers over the fabric, throat tight with emotion. "You're very kind, but why help me? You don't know me." Opal's hands stilled on the dress. "I knew your husband, though. Charles Harrow came through here 2 years ago, talking about his dream of fair water rights for all. The railroad men laughed then, too." She met Clementine's eyes. "My Herbert, the pastor, he always said God puts us where we're needed. Maybe that's why you're here now." Later, after a simple but filling supper, they gathered in Opal's sitting room. Clementine stood before the fireplace, practicing her speech for tomorrow's hearing. The blue dress, expertly altered by Opal's swift needle, transformed her, not by hiding her size, but by dignifying it. "If you're to shame the devils," Opal had said while making the final adjustments, "you best look like a queen." Now Clementine's voice rang clear and strong as she rehearsed her arguments. These deeds, signed and notarized in London, proved that the water rights were legally transferred to a cooperative trust. "My husband's vision was for shared access, for settlers and Apache alike. The railroad's claims are fraudulent, built on forged documents and false testimony." Ezekiel leaned against the mantel, his scarred face grave. "The railroad men won't take kindly to being called liars in open court. They've got hired guns in town. Saw them when we rode in." "Thugs and bullies," Opal sniffed, her knitting needles clicking steadily. "But they're not the only ones with connections. Half the women in my sewing circle have husbands or brothers who served with the federal marshal. Once word reaches him about this hearing..." She smiled grimly. "Well, let's just say news travels fast when ladies start talking." The grandfather clock in the corner struck 10, its deep chime filling the room. Opal set aside her knitting and stood. "Time for a word with the Lord, I reckon. Join hands if you're willing." They formed a small circle in the firelight. Clementine felt the strength in Ezekiel's calloused hand, the gentle warmth of Opal's grip. The older woman's voice was soft, but steady as she prayed. "Lord, we ask your blessing on tomorrow's battle, not with guns or fists, but with truth and justice. Guide Clementine's words, strengthen her spirit. Watch over those who stand with her, both here and in the Apache settlement, and remind us all that your love flows as free as water, meant to nourish every soul, regardless of status or station. Amen." "Amen," Clementine whispered, and felt Ezekiel's hand tighten briefly around hers before letting go. Dawn broke over Silver Bluff, painting the courthouse's weathered clapboards in shades of rose and gold. Already townspeople gathered on the dusty street, their excited chatter filling the morning air. Most had come hoping for another show like the auction, another chance to mock the fallen British lady. Inside the courthouse, inside the house, oil lamps cast a yellow glow over the cramped room. Wooden benches creaked under the weight of settlers, merchants, and ranch hands who packed the space shoulder to shoulder. The air grew thick with pipe smoke and the musty smell of damp wool. Judge Harrison Morton sat behind his elevated desk, his jowled face ruddy in the lamplight. His small eyes darted between Samuel Pritchard and Ezra Bolton, who lounged near the front with the easy confidence of men accustomed to getting their way. Pritchard cut a dashing figure in his tailored suit, his silver watch chain gleaming. "Your Honor," he drawled, laying a stack of documents on the judge's desk, "these deeds clearly show our company's rightful claim to the watershed rights. The original transfer was properly witnessed and recorded." He shot a smug glance toward the empty defendant's chair. Bolton, built like a bull with fists to match, cracked his knuckles and grinned at the crowd. Several people shifted uneasily, well aware of his reputation for midnight visits to those who crossed the railroad's interests. The courthouse door creaked open. A hush fell over the room as Lady Clementine Harrow entered, her head held high. The blue dress Miss Opal had altered fit her perfectly, lending her an air of quiet dignity. Ezekiel Boone followed close behind, his towering presence casting a shadow across the floorboards. His scarred face was set in stern lines as he took up position just behind Clementine's chair, like a guardian mountain at her back. Titters and whispers rippled through the crowd. "There's the dollar bride," someone stage whispered, drawing scattered laughs. Judge Morton cleared his throat. "Lady Harrow, while I appreciate your determination, I have before me clear documentation of the railroad's claim. Unless you can produce evidence to the contrary, I'll have no choice but to dismiss your petition." "Evidence, Your Honor?" Clementine's voice rang clear and strong. She reached into a leather portfolio and withdrew a thick sheaf of papers bound in blue ribbon. "I have here the original water rights deeds, signed and notarized in London, establishing a cooperative trust for shared access between settlers and the Apache Nation." She placed them firmly on the judge's desk. Before anyone could react, she produced a second document, a leather-bound ledger with dog-eared pages. "And this, Your Honor, is my late husband's personal record of every bribe offered by Mr. Pritchard's associates, every forged document they created, and every threat made against those who refused to cooperate." The room erupted in gasps and exclamations. Pritchard's face drained of color. Bolton half rose from his seat, his meaty hands clenched into fists, but Ezekiel shifted his weight slightly, one hand resting casually near his belt. The foreman slowly sat back down. Judge Morton's hands trembled slightly as he opened the ledger. His eyes widened as he scanned the careful columns of dates, names, and amounts. Many of those names belonged to men sitting right there in his courtroom. "These are serious allegations, Lady Harrow," he said, his voice notably less dismissive. "Very serious indeed." He glanced nervously at Pritchard, then at several prominent townsmen who had suddenly found the floor very interesting. "They are facts, Your Honor," Clementine corrected firmly, "facts supported by witness statements, bank drafts, and correspondence. My husband may have died before he could expose this corruption, but he left everything in order. I suggest you examine page 47 with particular care." The judge flipped to the indicated page. His face went from red to pale and back again. Everyone in the room knew that whatever was written there had changed everything. That is, Judge Morton tugged at his collar. "In light of this new evidence, I have no choice but to order a full hearing. Court will reconvene in 1 week's time, during which I expect all parties to present their complete arguments." He banged his gavel quickly, as if afraid someone might object. The crowd burst into excited conversation. Pritchard shoved his chair back and stormed out, Bolton lumbering in his wake. But many others lingered, looking at Clementine with new eyes. Not mocking now, but wondering what other surprises this remarkable woman might have in store. Ezekiel stepped forward and quietly offered Clementine his arm. She took it with a small, dignified smile, and together they walked out of the courthouse into the bright morning sun. Behind them, the whispers had taken on a different tone entirely, one of respect, tinged with more than a little awe. The courthouse grew stuffy as afternoon sun streamed through its dusty windows. Judge Morton mopped his brow with a handkerchief, while Pritchard's lawyer, Wesley Hammond, strutted before the packed gallery like a rooster in a henhouse. His polished boots clicked against the wooden floor as he gestured dramatically toward Clementine. "Your Honor," Hammond declared, his voice dripping with theatrical disdain, "how can this court take seriously the claims of a woman who mere days ago was auctioned off like common chattel, a charity case, bought for $1 by a mountain hermit?" He turned to face the gallery, playing to the crowd. Are we to believe that someone of such diminished circumstances could possibly understand the complexities of water rights and property law? Scattered chuckles rippled through the courthouse. Clementine sat straight-backed in her chair, her face composed despite the flush creeping up her neck. The leather portfolio containing her husband's documents lay open before her, each page carefully marked with blue ribbon. Furthermore, Hammond continued, these so-called records she's produced could easily be fabricated. After all, what desperate person wouldn't forge documents to escape destitution? He smiled, all teeth and no warmth. I move that Lady Harrow's evidence be dismissed as suspect, given her current situation. Before Judge Morton could respond, a chair scraped against the floor. Ezekiel Boone rose to his full height, his shadow falling across Hammond's smug face. The lawyer took an involuntary step backward. Your Honor, Ezekiel's deep voice filled the room. I'd like to speak, if you'll permit it. Judge Morton nodded, perhaps curious what the usually silent mountain man had to say. The gallery fell quiet, every eye fixed on Ezekiel's imposing figure. Folks here know me, Ezekiel began, his words measured and clear. I've traded furs in this town for 15 years, never spoke more words than needed, never made claims I couldn't back with truth. He paused, scanning the faces before him. But today I'm speaking up because there's something needs saying about honor. He took a step forward, his boots thudding heavily on the floorboards. A man's honor, or a woman's, ain't measured by banknotes or fancy clothes. It's measured by their word, their courage to stand up for what's right. His scarred face turned toward Hammond. Lady Clementine could have sold these documents to the railroad for a fortune, could have run away with more money than any of us will see in a lifetime. Instead, she's fighting to protect water rights for folks who mocked her, who laughed at her misfortune. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Several townspeople shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding each other's eyes. Ezekiel continued, his voice growing stronger. I've seen men in fine suits lie through their teeth, seen rich men steal from poor families with nothing but paper and ink, and I've seen proud people brought low by circumstances they didn't deserve. He gestured toward Clementine. This lady lost everything because she trusted the wrong people, but she never lost her dignity, her determination to see justice done. More voices joined the murmuring now, some nodding in agreement. In the back row, Miss Opal dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even Judge Morton leaned forward, caught by the simple power of Ezekiel's words. So when this fancy lawyer talks about being worthy of trust, Ezekiel's gaze bore into Hammond. I reckon we ought to look at actions, not auctions. Look at who's fighting for fair water rights for all people, Apache and settler alike, and who's trying to steal them through false papers and threats. The courthouse had grown so quiet you could hear the wind whistling through the eaves. Hammond's face had turned an interesting shade of purple, while Pritchard glowered from his seat, his fingers drumming against the table. Judge Morton cleared his throat. While this is irregular, Mr. Boone makes valid points about character and credibility. He shuffled through the papers before him. Given the serious nature of Lady Harrow's evidence and Mr. Boone's testimony to her character, I have no choice but to halt all land seizure proceedings until federal marshals can arrive to investigate these allegations of fraud. He banged his gavel decisively. This court is adjourned until such time as proper authorities can review all documents and claims. The current water rights arrangements will remain in place until then. The gallery erupted in excited chatter. Pritchard stormed out, shouldering roughly past people in his way. Bolton lingered by the door, his dark eyes fixed on Ezekiel and Clementine, with barely concealed menace. Clementine gathered her documents with trembling hands, though her face remained composed. Ezekiel stepped to her side, offering his arm with quiet dignity. Together, they walked down the courthouse aisle, past rows of townspeople who now regarded them with a mixture of shame, respect, and cautious admiration. Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver Bluff's main street. The air felt charged, like the moments before a storm. Clementine tightened her grip on Ezekiel's arm, sensing the tension that hummed through the town like a plucked wire. Their victory was real, but so was the danger it had stirred up. Neither spoke as they descended the courthouse steps, their footsteps echoing in the strange, watchful silence that had fallen over Silver Bluff. Miss Opal's cozy parlor offered brief respite from the tension outside. The clock on her mantel ticked steadily as she poured steaming tea into delicate cups, her movements precise, despite the worry etched on her face. Clementine sat in a cushioned chair, her court documents spread across her lap, while Ezekiel stood near the window, watching the street with wary eyes. The sudden thunder of hoofbeats shattered their quiet moment. Taklishim burst through the door, his chest heaving, dust coating his clothes. Sweat streaked his face as he gripped the doorframe for support. "They ride for the spring," he gasped out. "Pritchard's men, hired guns. They carry oil barrels." His dark eyes met Ezekiel's. "They mean to burn it all." Ezekiel's face hardened. "When?" "They left an hour ago, taking the low trail." Taklishim straightened, catching his breath. "If we ride hard through Shadow Canyon, we might catch them." Clementine rose quickly, papers scattering. "We must stop them before the marshals arrive. Without the spring, there'll be nothing left to rule on," Ezekiel finished grimly. He grabbed his rifle from beside the door. "Miss Opal, we'll need your fastest horses." The older woman was already moving. "Take Thunder and Rose from the stable. They know the mountain trails." Minutes later, they thundered out of Silver Bluff, Taklishim leading on his paint horse, Ezekiel and Clementine following on Miss Opal's mounts. The moon cast sharp shadows across the rocky terrain as they pushed their horses hard, taking the treacherous mountain switchbacks at a dangerous pace. Clementine gripped her reins tightly, every bump and jostle testing her seat. Her thighs burned from the unfamiliar strain, but she pressed on, following Taklishim's lead through narrow passes and across shallow creek beds. The night air grew colder as they climbed higher into the mountains. Ezekiel rode close beside her, watching for signs she might falter. "You're doing fine," he called out, his voice barely carrying over the drumming hooves. "Keep your weight centered." Hours passed in a blur of moonlit rock and shadow. Their horses' flanks grew slick with sweat. Their breathing labored on the steep trails. Twice they had to slow to navigate particularly treacherous stretches, precious minutes slipping away as they picked their path carefully through loose scree. The first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky when Taklishim suddenly reined in hard. He pointed to the horizon, where a dark smudge of smoke rose against the pale light. "There!" They urged their tired mounts forward, cresting a final ridge. The sight below struck them like a physical blow. Flames licked up from the spring, turning the precious water into a sheet of fire. The sweet water that had sustained generations now reeked of oil and smoke. A dozen rough-looking men stood around the burning spring, led by Pritchard's foreman, Jake McClintock. Their horses were hobbled nearby, steam rising from their worked bodies. Empty oil barrels lay scattered on the ground, their contents feeding the inferno. Ezekiel's face contorted with rage. He spurred his horse down the slope, closing the distance in seconds. Before McClintock could reach for his gun, Ezekiel was on him, his massive fist connecting with the foreman's jaw in a brutal arc. But McClintock wasn't alone. Two of his men grabbed Ezekiel from behind, while another delivered a crushing blow to his ribs. Ezekiel stumbled, trying to regain his footing on the slick ground. McClintock, recovered now, drove his boot into Ezekiel's chest, sending him sprawling. "Ezekiel!" Clementine's cry echoed across the clearing as she and Taklishim arrived. The gang members turned toward them, hands hovering near their weapons. McClintock spat blood, then grinned through red-stained teeth. "Our work here's done anyway." He mounted his horse, gesturing to his men. "Let's ride. These folks can enjoy their little bonfire." The gang mounted up and rode out, their laughter carrying back on the wind. Clementine rushed to Ezekiel's side, helping him sit up. Blood trickled from a cut above his eye, and he winced, holding his ribs. Taklishim stood at the edge of the burning spring, his face a mask of anguish. Generations of his people's history, their very survival in these harsh lands, went up in flames before them. The sacred waters that had flowed since before memory now burned with an unholy fire, thick black smoke rising into the dawn sky. They watched helplessly as the flames consumed their hopes. Their victory in court turned to bitter ash. The spring that had brought life to this arid land, that had united Apache and settler in common cause, now served as a funeral pyre for justice itself. The sun rose fully over the mountains, painting the smoke-filled sky in shades of blood and gold. Ezekiel's wounded body trembled with helpless fury beside Clementine, while Taklishim's silent tears reflected the dancing flames. They had ridden through the night with desperate purpose, only to arrive too late. The morning wind carried the acrid smell of their defeat across the awakening land. The journey back to Nantan's camp was slow and painful. Ezekiel's ribs protested with each bump of the trail, though he stubbornly refused to stop. Clementine rode close beside him, watching his drawn face with concern. The morning sun climbed higher, baking the dusty earth as they picked their way down from the burned spring. Taklishim had ridden ahead to bring word to his people. By the time Ezekiel and Clementine reached the settlement, the entire camp had gathered. The news of the spring's destruction hung heavy in the air, pressing down like a physical weight. Nantan stood at the center of his people, his weathered face carved deep with grief. Women wept quietly, while children clung to their mothers' skirts, sensing the adults' distress. The destruction of the spring struck at the very heart of their community. "Let me help you down," Clementine said softly to Ezekiel. He accepted her support without protest, a sign of how much pain he was in. Miss Opal's borrowed dress was stained with dirt and soot, but Clementine carried herself with quiet dignity as she helped Ezekiel to a seat by the main fire. A young Apache woman brought over a pot of healing salve, gesturing to Ezekiel's injuries. As she gently applied the medicine to his bruised ribs and cut forehead, the camp's healer murmured prayers in her native tongue. "The spring sustained us through countless dry seasons," Nantan spoke at last, his voice heavy. "Without it, how will our children survive?" The question hung in the air, unanswered. Several of the younger men muttered angrily about revenge, their hands straying to weapon belts. The tension in the camp grew thick enough to cut with a knife. Clementine stood slowly, drawing herself up to her full height. "All is not lost," she said, her clear voice carrying across the hushed gathering. She reached into her travel satchel and withdrew a rolled parchment, weathered but intact. "My husband was many things," she continued, spreading the document on a flat rock near the fire. "But he was not a fool. He knew the value of water in these lands." Her fingers traced lines on what proved to be a detailed survey map. Nantan moved closer, his keen eyes studying the markings. Ezekiel, despite his pain, leaned forward with interest. "Here." Clementine pointed to a marked section southeast of the burned spring. "My husband discovered signs of an underground water source, an aquifer. He purchased the land rights quietly, planning to develop it for community use." She looked up at the gathered faces. "The deed is still valid, held in trust with his other papers." Hope flickered across Nantan's face, like sunrise breaking through storm clouds. "You are certain?" "The survey was thorough," Clementine nodded. "The water table is deep but strong. My husband's notes suggest it could support both the settlement and the surrounding homesteads." Ezekiel shifted carefully, mindful of his ribs. "Why didn't your husband develop it?" "The railroad investment consumed his attention," Clementine replied. "And then his illness." She paused, then squared her shoulders. "But perhaps that was providence. This water source remained hidden when Pritchard and his ilk seized everything else." Nantan studied the map intently, his finger tracing the terrain markers. After a long moment, he looked up at his people. The despair had lifted from his face, replaced by determined purpose. "The spirits work in mysterious ways," he said. "Perhaps they guided this knowledge to us through you, Lady Harrow, at the moment of our greatest need." He turned to address the gathering. "We can file a cooperative claim, join our rights with Lady Harrow's deed. The law must recognize such an alliance." Clementine nodded eagerly. "A public cooperative claim, filed before Pritchard's men even know of the aquifer's existence. They'll have no grounds to challenge it." The camp stirred with renewed energy. Hope spread through the gathering like ripples in a pond. Women began preparing travel packs, while men checked their horses. Even the children sensed the shift in mood, their earlier fear replaced by excitement. Ezekiel watched Clementine with quiet admiration. The woman who had been publicly humiliated at auction just days ago now stood tall, her natural dignity restored by purpose. She had transformed their defeat into an opportunity for something even better, true partnership between settlers and Apache. Nantan raised his hands for attention. "We must move quickly. Taklishim, choose 4 riders. Send 2 to notify friendly settlers who will support our claim. Send 2 more to watch Pritchard's men. We must know if they learn of our plans." The camp burst into purposeful activity. As the appointed riders mounted up, Nantan turned to Clementine and Ezekiel. "You have brought us new hope, my friends. Now we must work together to make it real." Clementine carefully rolled up the precious map, her face set with determination. The hidden aquifer represented more than just water. It was a chance to build the kind of community her husband had dreamed of, where cooperation replaced conflict. Looking around at the bustling camp, she knew they had found the strength to make that dream come true. The early morning sun cast long shadows as their small caravan set out from the Apache camp. Ezekiel rode stiffly beside Clementine's wagon, his bruised ribs making each step of his horse a lesson in endurance. Behind them, Nantan led a group of his people, while several settlers who had answered their call brought up the rear. Clementine held the reins with steady hands, her eyes fixed on the distant hills where the aquifer lay hidden. The map rested securely in her satchel, its weathered edges marking the path to their future. She had memorized every detail, every contour line that her husband had so carefully drawn. "There's the Henderson place up ahead," Ezekiel said, gesturing to a modest homestead. "Tom Henderson's got influence with the smaller ranchers hereabouts." Clementine nodded, guiding the wagon toward the ranch house. "Then we'll speak with him. Every voice matters now." Tom Henderson met them at his gate, shotgun in hand, and suspicion in his eyes. But Clementine climbed down from her wagon with dignity, spreading the survey map across his fence post. As she explained the cooperative water rights plan, Henderson's expression shifted from doubt to interest. "You mean to say we'd all have guaranteed access?" he asked, running a calloused finger along the map's lines. "Equal shares, protected by law," Clementine confirmed. "No more fighting over water rights. No more being at the mercy of railroad men's greed." Henderson studied Nantan for a long moment, then looked back at Clementine. "My grandchildren might actually have a future here," he said slowly. "Count me in." By midday, their group had grown. Henderson rode with them, bringing 2 neighboring families. The sight of settlers and Apache traveling together drew attention at every homestead they passed. Clementine spoke to each group they met, her words building bridges across years of mistrust. The first day's journey ended at sunset. As they made camp, Ezekiel watched Clementine moving among the travelers, checking on needs, solving disputes with quiet authority. Her size, once mocked, now seemed to lend her a natural presence that commanded respect. "She has the heart of a true leader," Nantan observed, settling beside Ezekiel near the fire. "The spirits chose well when they guided her to us." The second day dawned clear and hot. Ezekiel's injury slowed their pace, but no one complained. The group had bonded around their shared purpose, settlers and Apache alike, helping each other along the trail. Near noon, they crested a rise overlooking a broad valley. Clementine raised her hand, bringing the caravan to a halt. "There," she said, pointing to a rocky outcrop. "That's the marker my husband described. The aquifer lies beneath." The site itself seemed unremarkable, just another patch of sun-baked earth. But as Clementine read from her husband's notes, describing the underground water source waiting to be tapped, excitement spread through the group. They made their way down to the valley floor. Nantan's people quickly established a camp while the settlers gathered to examine the survey markers. Clementine supervised it all, her natural organizational skills turning chaos into order. As the sun began its westward slide, Clementine called everyone together. She stood beside a wooden stake that had been carefully prepared, decorated with both settler and Apache symbols of blessing. "This moment," she began, her voice carrying across the hushed gathering, "is not about one person's claim or one group's rights. This is about building a future where our children never know the fear of running dry, where cooperation replaces conflict." She gripped the stake firmly. "In accordance with territorial law, we claim this aquifer as a public trust, held in common by all who have gathered here to witness." With strength born of conviction, Clementine drove the stake deep into the ground. The sound of wood meeting earth echoed across the valley like a covenant being sealed. A cheer went up from the assembled group. Settlers shook hands with Apache warriors. Women from both communities began sharing food. Children who hours ago might have feared each other now played together in the dusty soil. Ezekiel made his way to Clementine's side, moving carefully but with pride in his eyes. "You've done what no one thought possible," he said softly. "You've given them all something bigger than their differences to believe in." Clementine watched the scene before her, remembering the humiliation of the auction yard that now seemed a lifetime ago. "No," she replied. "We've done this together, all of us." She patted the stake that now marked the beginning of their shared future. "This is just the beginning." The news traveled faster than any horse could gallop. By mid-morning, dust clouds rose on the horizon as riders approached from Silver Bluff. Ezekiel, watching through his spyglass, recognized Pritchard's gleaming black stallion leading the charge. "They're coming," he called down from his lookout position. "About 10 riders, Pritchard and Bolton among them." Clementine stood beside the claim stake, her documents spread neatly on a makeshift table. The morning breeze ruffled the papers, held down by stones at each corner. Behind her, the settlers and Apache stood united, a living wall of determination. The riders thundered into the valley, their horses' hooves kicking up clouds of dust. Samuel Pritchard reined in hard, his fancy vest spotted with trail dirt. Ezra Bolton slouched in his saddle beside him, an ugly sneer twisting his face. "This is private railroad territory," Pritchard announced, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "Clear out now, and we'll forget this foolishness." Clementine stepped forward, her head high. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Mr. Pritchard. These lands were legally acquired by my late husband, and I hold the original deeds." She gestured to the documents on the table. "Furthermore, this site has been claimed as a public trust, with all proper witnesses and documentation." Bolton spat in the dust. "Ain't nobody gonna recognize the claim of some auction-bought woman and her Indian friends?" A murmur of anger rippled through the crowd. Tom Henderson stepped forward, his weathered face dark with anger. "Watch your mouth, Bolton. Lady Clementine speaks for all of us here." Pritchard's charm turned cold. He nodded to his men, who began to spread out, hands hovering near their gun belts. "Then you're all trespassing. Clear out, or we'll make you clear out." The tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Settlers and Apache alike stood their ground, though no one reached for a weapon. Clementine remained perfectly still, her eyes locked on Pritchard's face. Then, from the eastern ridge, came the sound of horses. Many horses. All heads turned to see a line of riders in blue uniforms descending into the valley, badges glinting in the morning sun. "Federal Marshals!" someone shouted. Leading the marshals was Taklishim. sitting tall in his saddle. His message had gotten through after all, and help had arrived right when they needed it most. The lead marshal, a gray-haired man with steel in his eyes, dismounted and approached the gathering. "I'm Marshal James Cooper. We received word of land fraud and illegal seizures in this territory." His gaze swept over the scene, settling on Clementine. "Would you be Lady Harrow?" "I am," Clementine replied, gesturing to her documents. "Everything is in order, Marshal. Original deeds, witness statements, and evidence of certain parties' attempted fraud." Cooper examined the papers methodically, while his deputies kept watch. Pritchard's confident smile began to fade as the marshal's frown deepened. "These documents are entirely in order," Cooper announced finally. "The aquifer claim is legal and binding." He turned to face Pritchard and Bolton. "However, these records of bribery and forged deeds are another matter entirely." Bolton wheeled his horse around, but found his path blocked by deputy marshals, rifles raised. Pritchard's charm dissolved into desperate anger. "You can't do this," Pritchard shouted. "We're bringing progress to this territory. These people are standing in the way of civilization." "The only thing you're bringing is greed and corruption," Cooper replied evenly. He nodded to his deputies. "Take them into custody. Charges are land fraud, bribery of public officials, and attempted claim jumping." The crowd watched in satisfaction as Pritchard and Bolton were disarmed and handcuffed. The railroad men's hired muscle, seeing their bosses detained, quickly surrendered without a fight. "By federal authority," Cooper announced, "this aquifer site is now under Marshal's protection as a public cooperative trust." He tipped his hat to Clementine. "Lady Harrow, I believe you have some water rights documents for me to officially record." A cheer went up from the gathered settlers and Apache. Women embraced, children danced, and men shook hands across old boundaries. Tom Henderson led a group in securing the railroad men's abandoned horses. Taklisham dismounted beside his father. Nantan's usual stoic expression softened with pride in his son. "You rode well," the elder said simply, touching his son's shoulder. More riders were arriving now, townsfolk from Silver Bluff, who had heard the news and come to see justice done. Among them was Miss Opal, carrying a basket of fresh bread and beaming with satisfaction. The marshals organized their prisoners for the ride back to the territorial seat. As Pritchard was led past Clementine, he stopped and glared at her. "You don't know what you've done. The railroad won't forget this." Clementine met his gaze calmly. "No, Mr. Pritchard, you don't know what we've done. We've built something stronger than your railroad. We've built community." The crowd's cheers followed the marshals and their prisoners out of the valley. Clementine stood by the claim stake, watching justice ride away with the morning sun climbing high overhead. The autumn air rang with the sound of hammers and saws as settlers and Apache worked side by side at the aquifer site. Wooden scaffolding rose around the natural spring, while trenches traced paths where water channels would soon flow. The scent of fresh-cut pine mixed with wood smoke from the work camps. Clementine sat at her makeshift office, a weathered table beneath a canvas awning, reviewing construction plans with Tom Henderson and Taklisham. Her precise notes detailed every measurement and material needed. Nearby, Ezekiel directed a team moving heavy support beams, his powerful shoulders straining as he demonstrated proper lifting technique. As dusk approached, Nantan called everyone to gather in a circle near the main spring. Torches flickered in the growing darkness, casting dancing shadows on expectant faces. The elder Apache stood tall, his silver hair gleaming in the firelight. "Tonight we welcome a new daughter to our people," Nantan announced, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed crowd. "One who has proven her worth not through blood, but through heart." Clementine stepped forward, her eyes bright with unshed tears. Nantan took her hands in his weathered ones. "You came to us as a stranger, cast out by your own kind," he continued. "But like the hummingbird, you refused to let your burdens ground you. You soared above hatred to bring life-giving water to all people." He touched her forehead gently. From this day forward, you shall be known among us as Hummingbird Woman." The gathered people erupted in soft calls of approval. Miss Opal dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while several Apache women stepped forward to embrace their new clan sister. Ezekiel watched from the edge of the circle, his scarred face softened with wonder. When Clementine passed near him later, he spoke quietly. "In all my years on the frontier, I never thought I'd see such a thing, settlers and Apache working as one people." "The land knows no boundaries," Clementine replied. "Neither should we." Just then, a shout went up from the work site. The first channel had been completed, and clear water from the aquifer began flowing through the newly carved path. Everyone rushed to watch as the life-giving stream caught the last rays of sunset, sparkling like liquid gold as it brought promise to the thirsty land. Spring blossoms dotted the hills around Silver Bluff as Clementine reviewed the cooperative's ledgers on the front porch of the Water Union office. The numbers told a story of success. Every homestead and ranch for 20 miles had fair access to the aquifer's bounty. Even in the dry season, no one went thirsty anymore. Through the window, she could hear Ezekiel teaching young Thomas Whitehawk about pump maintenance. His patient voice carried clearly as he explained the mechanics. The boy, son of an Apache mother and settler father, represented the new generation growing up without the old hatreds. Clementine smiled, remembering how far they'd come. Her own transformation had been as remarkable as the town's. Gone was the shame that once haunted her steps. She carried herself with the dignity of a woman who knew her true worth, measured not in pounds or dollars, but in lives touched and bridges built. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Main Street as townsfolk went about their business. Where once there had been sneers and mockery, now folks tipped their hats respectfully. Even old Samuel Pritchard's store, now run by his more honest nephew, displayed the cooperative's charter proudly in its window. Ezekiel emerged from the office, wiping grease from his hands. His eyes softened, as they always did when they fell upon Clementine. He settled into the chair beside her, the wood creaking comfortably beneath his weight. "Another good month?" he asked, nodding toward the ledger. "Better than good," Clementine replied, closing the book with satisfaction. Who would have thought a failed railroad venture could lead to all this? They gazed out over the bustling town square, where Apache traders and settler families mingled freely at the weekly market. The water tower rose proud against the setting sun, its shadow stretching toward the distant mountains. Clementine chuckled suddenly, breaking the comfortable silence. "You know, it turns out $1 buys you quite a life." Ezekiel's weathered face cracked into a rare, full smile. "And quite a woman," he replied softly, reaching for her hand. Together they watched the sun paint the western sky in shades of gold and purple, their shared shadow falling across the land they'd fought so hard to save. Thanks for spending a moment here with me. If this story touched you, let's keep this connection going. Hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.